Hey everybody, this is Javi, and you are watching the Inner Child Collective, where you and your inner child heal for the better. Welcome and hello. I hope everyone had a good weekend. I hope everyone's having a good week, especially since there has been some changes here. For one, like we now have a new president, Joe Biden, and a vice president, Kamala Harris. So everyone came out to vote, everyone represented, and now the regime is pretty much over with. So I'm really happy about that, to be honest with you. That's one thing, um, because it was a mess. And sooner or later, we're going to have to talk about it, maybe in a future episode and maybe in a video or something, really have a discussion about the trauma, 45 um, has caused people, has caused for generations, for many generations. Um, we're going to have that conversation about how children were very much affected by the Trump administration and the Trump regime. So, so that is something that we are to heal from, because let's be real, he's a trauma story. Let's be real. Um, I also wanted to talk a little bit about this episode too, before I get started. As you can see or as you can hear, if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, we're going to be listening, talking about emotional abuse in the inner child. And I'm going to be honest with you, like of all the episodes I've done, and of all the episodes I've done so far, this is by far, like, for me, this was like the hardest one to get together. Not because of the lack of information or anything of that nature, but because like it pretty much hit home, and it hit different. And it had me like thinking about something that happened to me around 4 years ago. In regards to someone I was living with back in 2016, when I was really struggling financially and struggling, with my mental health and financially, things of that nature, how like this person actually emotionally abused me. And I didn't even realize until I was doing the research for this particular episode. I did not, I seriously didn't know that I was being emotionally abused, and until I saw all the criteria and I saw the characteristics and the forms of emotional abuse, and it really hit different. But before we get started, y'all, for those who don't know who I am Javi Mason. And I am the founder and the creator of the Inner Child Collective. And here's some information about me. I'm a psychic, intuitive medium, and author who specializes in inner child therapy. And the way I work is that I put a strong emphasis on the impact generational trauma and historical trauma have had on us as children. And I also talk about the archetypes we've adopted in order to survive, the abuse and the trauma that we've gone through. And I also focus on the unconscious stories and the subconscious stories that are in our minds, and us living those stories and how we can rewrite those stories while working with our inner child. It's extremely important to rewrite our narrative in order for us to have something to look forward to through the healing process, because it's just really hard. And when you don't have like a goal, or a positive outlook on what, or at least an idea of how, you would like to have your life be like, you know, once you like get to the bulk of your healing work, then it's just like, what are you doing this for? So I definitely talk about how we are to decolonize our mind and have some sort of idea set, in regards to like what we would like our lives to be like, in order for us to keep going and not be so tired and not give up, before the miracle happens. So I talk about all that stuff. I talk about intersectionality. And also my housemate came up with this idea of me talking about pop culture more, especially since I was playing this game called Little Hope. It's a video game for PlayStation, really good game. And I definitely want to talk about that because it definitely talks about mental illness, uh, child traumas, And the way is it basically like self-redemption and self-forgiveness. And so that's something I would like to talk about because it definitely like falls in the category what this show is about. So, but basically that's what I do in a nutshell, right? In addition to talking about like spiritual stuff, how spirituality plays a huge part in your healing process. So yep, that's me. That's it, you know. Um, but here's some announcements. I do have inner child related services available for the collective, and anything from inner child archetype readings to personalized bedtime stories, because I do bedtime stories as well. I post those on my YouTube channel. So if you're interested in getting an in-depth reading or having your favorite children's book or story read to you, please visit the www.innerchildcollective.com to book an appointment. Just go to the service, uh, go to the service thing, the whatchamacallit, uh, the service page, and go ahead and click on the Inner Child Collective and pretty much do you. And the link will be in the descriptions anyway, so stay tuned for that. Also, if you're a fan of the Inner Child Collective, be sure to leave a review wherever you listen to it, whether it be iTunes or Spotify. If you can like even do that on your own pages. If you also have iTunes, you have the option of leaving a review. I think you have that option on Anchor as well. Wherever, please leave a review. It lets me know what you're thinking. It lets me know what you're looking for. And also I just like to know whether or not I have an impact on folks, because like I just love reading what people think. It's just another way for us to connect. So be sure to take it and like take advantage of that. Also, if you have a question or a comment you would like to have read on the show, you can email your question to the innerchildcollective@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment whenever I post a Q&A logo on my social media pages if you follow me on social media. And you do remain anonymous unless you state otherwise. Like, I don't want to put your business out there or put your name out there if your question or comment is attached to something that is very personal to you. So I just want to get that out there to you, that you have like the option. In fact, unless you state otherwise, like, you're going to be anonymous anyway. So just want to put that out there. So let's get started with the show. Let's get started with the discussion, because there is a lot to cover in regards to emotional abuse and the inner child. So this is what we're going to be talking about as far as like the topics and where we're going to go with this, because there's a lot about emotional abuse that is very much in the dark. We don't know a lot about it, and is actually the most of all of them, of all the forms of abuse, this is the one that is most, emotional abuse is the most misunderstood. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's talk about what's going to be covered first. So you're talking about what emotional abuse is, how emotional abuse affects us as children, the consequences of emotional abuse for adult survivors, and ways to reparent your inner child as an adult survivor of emotional abuse. So let me go through that one more time for people in the back. Just what we're going to be talking about on the show: what emotional abuse is, how emotional abuse affects us as children, the consequences of emotional abuse for adult survivors, and ways to reparent your inner child as a adult survivor of emotional abuse. So this is an important note to. These are important notes regarding the definition of emotional abuse. What's going on? Oh, that's my cat sneezing. So there is currently no concrete definition of emotional abuse. None whatsoever. Like, there's people, depending on what you read or where you go, everyone has like pretty much their own definition or their own variation or own spin on on emotional abuse and what it looks like. And what it is. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but there's no concrete definition. So for the purposes of this episode, emotional abuse is defined as a tactic perpetrators use to establish power and control over the child. Okay, so basically it's about establishing power and control, perpetrators establishing power and control over a child. So this is what emotional abuse is, according to the definition I um, told y'all about. So it's a tactic used by abusers as a way to control, manipulate, and dehumanize another human being emotionally, in this case, the child. It's also known as psychological abuse. Okay, so in many cases, emotional abuse and psychological abuse is interchangeable, but in my mind, is like something completely different, because emotional abuse is about like hurting the child's feelings, hurting their pride, hurting their self, or like hurting their feelings, in order to control, manipulate, and dehumanize them. So it's about making that child feel bad, making that child feel as if they are in a way or they're not good enough. So it's about the emotional part of it. But psychological abuse, from what I've seen and what I know about um, how the mind works, um, I feel that it like psychological abuse um, is it is what it is. It's a form of abuse because it affects the person's unconscious or subconscious mind, and the person's biochemicals within the brain. So psychologically, your brain is actually affected by the trauma. Like your neurotransmitters, all the amygdala and the your central nervous system, all kinds of parts of the brain are very much affected. So it's like a psychological thing. Also, like when it comes to your unconscious and subconscious mind, those that is also being attacked. Any form of abuse is affects the mind, but it all starts with the mind in regards to like psychological abuse, because your emotions are very much attached to it. How you feel about yourself, what you think about yourself, is very much attached to your emotions. So that's where I came up with that, as far as like psychological abuse and emotional abuse being somewhat different. But back to emotional abuse. So emotional abuse is usually associated with romantic partnerships, but any relationship can be emotionally abusive. Your friends can be abusive, your employer, family members, community members, teachers, or a pastor are examples of that. And also like the greater society, can be emotionally abusive towards people, especially marginalized and colonized people are emotionally abused by our society as a whole. So its impact stems from either an isolated incident or a series of incidents. You can actually be emotionally abused. You know, that could be um, an isolated incident, or the impact of the abuse can be, from an isolated incident, or like a teacher, calling you a name, or like for me in my case, being called ugly, like that is like an emotional abusive tactic to like bully someone, and that was basically set that particular day, and that incident, that isolated incident, pretty much set the tone for everything else, right? As far as my looks and how I felt about my looks. And then there's a series of incidents where you're consistently like being abused, or being emotionally abused, or being belittled, humiliated, or dehumanized, just so the perpetrator can have power and control over you. So emotional abuse is known to be the most difficult form of abuse to define. It's difficult to determine what is considered emotional abuse, because depending on cultures, depending on what is considered abuse, it can vary. And also, like, we don't, because there's no concrete definition, how can you even know, right? What is the criteria for emotional abuse? It's difficult to measure someone's experiences um, in with this form of abuse. You can't, when you're doing a study, like an empirical study, you can't measure someone else's experiences. You can't you can't like calculate it and put it in numbers, and things like that. So that's what I mean by that. Like for as far as research purposes, its impact isn't always apparent right away. Sometimes the impact isn't felt until weeks, months, and years. Like complex PTSD, sometimes the impact is not even felt until years later. It isn't tangible, and it's difficult to pin down the causation. And also, what constitutes emotional abuse varies depending on the demographic and its culture. So, like, for instance, Yelling at somebody, that is very common in the Black community, but like for white folks, that's a form of abuse to yell. So it's just like, it varies depending on the culture, and in many cases, forms of abuse are normalized within certain cultures, so it may not even be seen as a form of emotional abuse. Okay, so that's where that comes from. So emotional abuse is the most understood form of abuse of all the other forms because it is intangible. Emotions are interpersonal, therefore invisible. Like, you can't see love, you can't see sadness unless someone shows it on their face. You can't see the impact um, of someone's emotions, you can't see someone's emotions once they're impacted by something. You just can't. Not everyone is aware that they're being emotionally and psychologically abused. Like I said before, depending on the culture, depending on what type of household you have, depending on your culture, you may or may not be aware of the fact that you have been emotionally or psychologically abused because it's normalized. So emotional and psychological abuse tends to present itself in two forms. Omission is a form of abuse that involves emotional neglect. Is what is what's not. It's basically what the child isn't getting. Right? They're not getting love and affection. They're not getting attention. So basically, an example is withholding affection from a child, or or ignoring them. Right? So that is like a form of psychological abuse or emotional abuse as far as omission. Then there's commission, as far as emotional abuse, a form of abuse that involves rejecting the child and having no regard for their emotional state, is humiliating and insulting the child. So basically is what the perpetrator is doing and what they are showing the child, and what they are showing, it is very apparent what they're doing. Like, the behavior is very overt. So like, humiliating and insulting the child, calling them names, calling them stupid to make them feel bad about themselves when they get like a bad grade, or you don't want to be around your child, so you just talk about them, in front of other people. That is what commission, um, you know, emotional abuse looks like. So this type of a behavior leaves the child confused and hurt because they feel like they've done something wrong, um, to warrant this behavior towards them, or they believe that something is wrong with them and they are deserving of this abuse. And the reality is, the parents and the caregivers are just passing down unhealed generational trauma, generational and historical trauma onto their kids. They don't know any better. Um, or if they do, in fact, let me just back up. Whether they know it or not, the fact is, they are passing down unhealed generational and historical trauma. They have been taught that way. They have been treated that way. Their parents have been treated that way, so on and so forth, because of this 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 inability um, and this unwillingness to break the cycle. So that's the reality of it. That's why emotional abuse or any form of abuse takes place, because the caregivers and the parents or the people who are inflicting this abuse, they are unhealed. They have their own issues going on. It never has anything to do with the kid. It has never has, and just never does have anything to do with the babies. Okay, um, which is why it's so important that we talk about how white supremacy places this huge emphasis on shame and guilt, and how that plays a part in them shaming others, shaming different demographics, and that shame and that guilt and that need for perfection is actually passed down, from one kid to the next, one generation to the next, which is why we're going through a lot of these abuse, this abuse trauma right now. So that's something that we are to talk about in detail later on, but basically that's it. So other forms of behavior, um, other forms of or behaviors or associated with emotional abuse are bullying, blaming, shaming, emotional blackmail. I had to look that up. I didn't know what I'm like. I've heard of it, but I never knew it. But it's when the perpetrator uses fear, obligation, and guilt to establish and maintain control and power over the child. So basically, like fog, fear, obligation, and guilt is placed upon the victim in order for the perpetrator to maintain and obtain uh, power and control. And gaslighting is another one. False accusations, constant arguing, withholding affection and attention, the silent treatment, and trivializing the victim's concerns. Either trivializing or basically saying like it's not as bad as it was, right? So here's the characteristics of emotional abuse. Please, like I'm going to butcher this lady's name. I'm so bad about that. Pietrangelo and Pietrangelo of healthline.com lists the following characteristics of emotional abuse: humiliation, negating, and criticizing, which is belittling someone's achievements. I had that done to me before. Someone belittling your achievements, just to like not only have power and control over you, but to break your spirit and to lower your self-esteem. Control and shame, character assassination is a way to, go after somebody. You're a taker. You are, you're this, you're that. You're one of the worst human beings ever. You are the one who's emotionally abusive. You're the narcissist, basically, like putting a lot of labels on people, in order to establish that control psychologically and emotionally. So accusing, blaming, and denying something is true is basically gaslighting. Emotional neglect and isolation, withholding affection, codependence, making sacrifices to please the other person but is not reciprocated. So sometimes emotional abuse is impact on the person is very insidious. Very insidious. It doesn't hit you right away. And so here, there's like a pattern to this. And I feel like a lot of narcissists pull this as well. Excuse me, for the most part. Most abusers, most perpetrators don't make their intentions known initially. They don't come out and say like, say these things to you or like make you feel bad. They do a lot of love bombing. They use tactics like love bombing and overt affection in order to lower the victim's guard. Um, Abusers discover while their guard is down, abusers discover the victim's weaknesses and level of emotional and psychological thresholds. So basically, like, how far can they go, right? How far can I go with this person? And where are the boundaries? They're looking for that lack of boundary. And when in most cases, when you are coming from a household where there are no boundaries, you don't know what those boundaries are. And when you get into a relationship that is emotionally abusive, or you know, you're not aware of your boundaries. So how can you like establish them? So that's where that's coming from. And so the tactics change and their true intentions become known once the relationship progresses. There's a lot of things like with dating relationships or marriages. Like, in fact, that's what happened to my mom, at some point. And she got into a second marriage. And what ended up happening is that, like, my stepdad was very much a person who was nice to us. He was nice and very respectful towards us at the beginning. Very like basically like show like the best of himself to like get my mom's guard down and to get and to lower the guard of us kids. And so once they got married, he totally flipped a fucking script and like became this emotionally abusive, physically abusive, verbally abusive individual who basically used my mother's fear of being alone against her, and in some cases like turned me and my mom against one another, and our relationship was rocky anyway. And he only made it worse, to be honest with you. So that, like, again, like, that's an example, at least a personal example, of like emotional abuse, or any form of abuse not being apparent right away, because it just takes you by surprise at times. And so it leads to the abuse and the toxic nature of the relationship to take on a life of its own. Once you're in the thick of it, you tend to lose your identity and your sense of self. You don't trust your gut instincts anymore, because now you're questioning what you've seen, what you've heard, because you may have been gaslit for so long. You're constantly walking on eggshells in order to remain safe, because you don't know whether or not this person's going to pop off. Victims may become codependent upon their partner because they don't trust their mind and their thoughts anymore. You know, Victims are more likely to believe and internalize the abusive partner's criticism. After a while, when you're criticized so much, you start to believe in those, and start to internalize those stories, because you're thinking to yourself, is there some sort of validity to their statement? His statement, her statement, their statement is something about me um, giving off this vibe that he is talking about, they are talking about, she is talking about, and so you start to internalize a lot of those stories, and then you begin to like do everything you can to change yourself, out of mere survival, in order, to fix the problem when there was no problem to fix. They just want you to be a certain way so they can have power and control over you, psychologically and emotionally. And when victims break away from the relationship, the impact is still it's still felt emotionally, physically, and psychologically. I need to start, like, I read these notes. Let me say this. I read these notes sometimes. I'm like, yo, like, I'm thinking that I in my mind think that I am clear, and then I see the typos, but whatever. What I'm saying is very much truth, though. As long as you get the point, doesn't matter. But basically that's what happens. It's like the abuse and the toxic relationships that come with it takes on a life of its own once the relationship is established. And is to a side note here, it's very hard to leave those type of relationships when you feel as if you are not strong enough to do it, when you have been told time and time and time again that in order for you to survive, you need this relationship. You need this relationship, right? I'm the only one who is willing to put up with you. So you're going to stay here whether you like it or not, because nobody wants to be around you. Nobody wants to see you. Nobody wants to love you. I'm the one who's willing to like put up with the nonsense and the stupidity and so on and so forth that you are putting out there, right? So when you keep hearing those messages, you start to believe that nobody is here for you. That's why in a lot of these emotionally abusive relationships, these psychologically abusive relationships, the person's always isolated. The person is always isolated because the people who used to be in their life, the healthy people who genuinely love the victim, um, what ends up happening is that they're that beacon of light. Your support system is your beacon of light. When you have a so healthy support system, whether it be biological family members or chosen family, those are your beacon of light. That is your sounding board. They know that something's up. They are probably the ones to tell you, like, look, this motherfucker ain't right. You know what I mean? Like, they are the ones to tell you that, right? So what ends up happening is that the perpetrator knows this. The perpetrator wants you to be isolated as much as you possibly can be, in order for them to have complete control over your mind, your body, and your spirit. Because once they have other people, in the mix, they can't get away with anything. They can't get away because people who are very intuitive and people who are paying attention and know the patterns of abuse, okay? Because let's be real, perpetrators can't fool everybody. So when they have the opportunity of your friends to tell you, like, look, this person is not right, my gut is telling me that this is not correct, that's less power for the perpetrator. That's less control that the perpetrator has. So it's very important for them. Very important for them. Okay, it's paramount for them to get you by yourself and to put it in your mind that these people really don't care about you. I care about you. These people really don't care about you. They're trying to break up our relationship because they're jealous of you. They don't like the fact that I love you as much as I do. They don't like the fact that I love you and I'm looking out for you. They will put it in your mind, your perpetrator will put it in your mind that you have no real people out here. That emotionally and psychologically, they are the ones you are to be counting on because they are the ones who are telling you the truth. But that's not the case. That's really not the case at all. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people stay in relationships. This is a huge reason why the emotional and mental psychological abuse cycle continues. And when they break away from their relationship, it's very, very important that you have a safe space and have a place to go. And that's another thing. That's another reason why they don't want other people around, because they know that if they have other people in your corner that see what's going on, they're going to try to get you out of there. You have an out. You have a support system that is willing to risk their safety and possibly their life to get you out of there. Because let's be real, emotional abuse and psychological abuse can sometimes be physical when you try to leave. So what ends up happening is that they put you in a state of fear in order for you to not leave, because they know for a fact that if you try it, that's the lack of power for them, and they would rather have you gone and out of this world, or abuse you, like put their hands on you, to lose that power and control. And when you do get out and you manage to get out, the impact is still there, right? Psychologically, physically, and emotionally. It doesn't, just because you're physically out of the relationship doesn't mean you got out unscathed. So that's why it's so important for you to have a support system, a safety plan, and also to have a therapist with you. Because it's not just you being hurt, it's your inner child being hurt as well. To bring it back, your inner child is being hurt. Your inner child is basically is also being put through those situations. For all you know, they could be reenacting the abuse that they've gone through as you've gone through as a child. You're like people who remain in these relationships. They're reenacting abuse they have experienced as a child, most likely. So it's pretty much like you're still in the mode and still in the cycle, which is why, in a sense, even before you get into the relationship, it takes on a mind of its own. So this is how the emotional abuse affects kids, right? So emotional abuse often occur during childhood because the idea of getting into an emotional, that's a psychological, on the unconscious, subconscious, on the unconscious, subconscious level, right? What ends up happening is that once we end up internalizing a lot of these stories as children, that we are not good enough, that we have somehow deserved the abuse. So we internalize those stories, and we end up acting out those stories. So a lot of the emotional abuse or psychological abuse often occurs during childhood, when we're the most vulnerable emotionally, psychologically, developmentally. And when I say developmentally, I'm talking about our brains are developing. You know what I mean? And when it's developing to the point where we go by our emotions more than we go by our logic. The frontal lobe is not. When I talk about this in another episode, the frontal lobe is not developed as much as the limbic system is. So your amygdala and your hippocampus, they are developing, and they are the things that part of your brain that controls your emotional state. So from the ages 2 to 7, we are counting on adults around us. Our environments, the systems that we're a part of, we're counting on them to developmentally prepare us for the world, right? To tell us the truth about the world, to tell the truth about ourselves, to basically bring out the best of ourselves. Okay? We depend on those folks to tell us about the world and about ourselves in the environment around us. And this is also when children find out what's acceptable and what's not acceptable about us. Okay, this is when we find out what intersections are accepted and which ones are not. Our intersections are they are basically who we are. They are attributes, and they change over time depending on our life trajectory. But basically, our trajectory, right? But what ends up happening is that like we have these intersections, right? Um, like our race, our ethnicity, our social economic status, our body size, um, disability seen and unseen. Those are just examples. We figure out early on what's acceptable and what's not. So we observe how adults, our society, and the world reacts to our intersections, and what we experience what we experience due to other people's reactions, because we pay attention to those reactions and what we experience, depending on what type of intersection we have. Um, those stories and those messages are internalized, and what we internalize will become perpetual stories stored in the unconscious or subconscious mind. And then those stories then determine how we are to survive in the world and what we are to do and to say in order to survive in this world, in order for us to make it, right? And so whether it's positive or negative, a lot of what we learn is reinforced through how we feel about ourselves and how the world feels about us. And a lot of the messages that we receive in regards to our intersection, especially if you are emotionally or abused in general, but in this case, emotionally abused, you start to learn right away that something's wrong with you because of your intersections. And that's also a product of white supremacy and white supremacist ideologies, because our intersections were weaponized against us because of this white supremacist ideology around being a certain way and being perfect and just striving for whiteness and striving for anything associated with whiteness and white culture. Regardless, this is definitely affects marginalized and colonized people, black and brown people, indigenous people in particular, or I should say black folks and non-black people of color. That affects us the most. But what I also noticed that is that white folks have the tendency to use those tactics against one another. So as children, we learn that how people accept or don't accept our intersections and how they use that information to make us feel a certain way about ourselves. Okay, so the purpose of child emotional abuse is to dehumanize, manipulate, and humiliate a child in order to force them to behave a certain way. So children learn from abusive adults or peers or society as a whole, what is acceptable and what's not acceptable when it comes to them. And so those who have been emotionally abused those who have been emotionally abused as children, are more likely to internalize harmful, untrue stories about themselves and their intersections. Right? You're too fat. You're too dark. You are stupid, even though you may be a dyslexic or ADHD, or have ADHD or be autistic. You're weird because of your clothes, you know, um, because of your interests. And when I think about it, because you come off it, you're too sensitive. So you're gay. You're poor because you got on XJ 900 instead of Jordans. There's so many things that, we have internalized because, for one, we get the message that we're not okay by, as ourselves. But then, like, you have all these other people, as time goes on, those stories are reenacted because psychologically that's what we are drawn to, that, or that's what we believe in ourselves. So we end up in a way, like, attracting that, in a sense. And when I mean attracting, I mean we're finding, it's as if we're reenacting the abuse, and we're like finding proof. We're finding proof that this stuff, these untrue stories are true. Right? That's what I mean. We see that we view these stories, or these children view these stories as accurate. And so what ends up happening is that the child ends up developing a low sense of self, a negative perception of the self. Maybe I am too ugly. Maybe I am too dark. Maybe maybe I need to, maybe I need to get some money because I'm too poor. Maybe I am too skinny. Maybe I am stupid. I can't concentrate. Maybe there is something wrong with me because I'm a Muslim. We start to internalize those stories. You start to internalize them. And they start to internalize them as well, these kids. And they view it as truth. Because again, when you view something as truthful, you start to literally, like, energetically reenact, because you start to act as if. And because what you think about yourself is what you feel about yourself. And what you feel about yourself, you're going to act on it. And people in the world reacts in kind. So we develop this negative perception of self, and we would use those negative perceptions to develop coping and for survival mechanisms. So children who are emotionally abused were more likely to develop the coping and defense mechanisms to survive their experiences. And some of them are self-harm, hair pulling. There are people who may like have dermatillomania. I personally have trichotillomania. I developed it, it's a hair pulling disorder. And so I developed that when I was a kid, because I became so anxious about my parents arguing. So that's a form of self-harm, right? There's anxiety, depression, other mental health issues as well. Being anxious all the time to avoid conflict, depressed all the time in order to face your conflict. You don't have any spoons left, so you just shut down. People pleasing is another one. Bullying, emotional withdrawal, difficulty establishing and maintaining relationships. You may be staying away from relationships, or having a hard time connecting with people because of your emotional abuse. You feel like people are going to leave you, so you don't go away, or you may cling on to people, which would cause difficulties. Aggression, and I don't know why I got bullying down here twice, but basically that's what it is. Those are a few of the things that we that we deal with, at least children who are emotionally abused, what they deal with. So here are the consequences of our emotional abuse for survivors, adult survivors. Emotionally abused children often become emotionally abused adults. That shit doesn't go away just because you're an adult. If anything, your inner child, once you become an adult, your inner child becomes a part of you on an unconscious level, and they're using your body to reenact their abuse. So many abuse survivors, so now my phone goes off. So many survivors don't even realize that they're being emotionally abused. We walk around in defense and coping, like we're in defense mode all the time. We're survival all the time. So sometimes, like, most of the adult survivors don't even know they went through this type of abuse. And there are a few reasons for that. For one, like I said before, there's no concrete definition of what emotional abuse is. There is no concrete definition. Everyone, depending on where you go, has their own definition. So there's no, like, there's just no solid definition of what that is. So if there's no solid definition, what's the criteria to follow or to go by? The behavioral traits vary across demographics. So like I said before, like different cultures have an idea of what uh, abuse is and emotional abuse is. Okay, there are many countries that have like a total disregard for children, um, and they get away with it. You know, it's normalized as a result. Um, it's just normalized. Whereas in other countries or other parts of the world, even looking at it, like even spanking a child is considered abuse. So that or yelling at a child is considered abusive. Depending on the intent, it's all about the intent, but and how the child feels, but that varies across demographics. They've adapted to the behavior to the point of normalizing and rationalizing the abusive behavior. So there are people who are just like they've been emotionally abused so much, or due to their culture and or the household they lived in. They're like they've adapted. They've adapted to the point where they may believe it, or there's a part of them that rejects it, but they're still they're not impacted by it. So it's like, or they are impacted by it, but it doesn't they rationalize it by saying like they've done something wrong, or they've done something to bring on that behavior. So that is like they just rationalize it and say like I was a bad kid. I see that in the Black community a lot. I was a bad kid, therefore I deserve to get my ass whooped. I deserve to be yelled at because I was doing too much. I see that all the time in the Black community. There's a fear of disrespecting or being disloyal to those who have abused them. People don't like to talk bad about their parents. People don't they minimize a lot of the emotional abuse they went through because they do not want to seem disloyal to the caretaker. They don't want to seem disloyal to family members. In a Black community, they there's this, even though the abuse is going on, there is this fear of being disrespectful, because in most households respect towards adults is very much emphasized, and we get this message that we are to be seen and not heard, and in fact in some cases we are not to be seen, and we don't have an opinion. What your parents say to you, you are to respect that because they're raising you, and because you're not on the street and you're not on drugs and you're not out here being in jail and just doing out here on the streets ripping and running and doing the most. They raised you right. So there is that level, that's that disrespect, that level of disloyalty that we just like. There's this fear of being disrespectful and loyal to the family, because of that of respect culture within the Black community. So like, and there's also the impact isn't realized until they sought professional help. There are people who don't even know they've gone through that. They can't hold a relationship. They can't hold down a job. They're always snapping at the kids. They're belittling their children. And they don't even know what's happening. They just know that they're behaving a certain way, but they really don't put two and two together until they get professional help from a therapist or a spiritual advisor. And that's when they start to connect the dots, because at least a therapist, they have the criteria, they have somewhat of a criteria as to like what emotional abuse looks like. And so what ends up happening is that like once they get professional help and they start to tell their story, and everyone starts to connect the dots, that's when you start to realize it. And also like people just don't, like I said, like people don't feel the impact until like years, months, weeks down the line. So that's one of the, like, those are all the reasons why a lot of people don't realize they've been emotionally abused. And if the survivor is a parent with unresolved issues around emotional abuse, they're more likely to inflict harm onto their child or children. I can't even tell you how many times I was yelled at by my mom, um, how I was yelled at, belittled, humiliated by my father. You know, having him withhold affection or make it seem as if because I dressed a certain way or acted a certain way, I was an embarrassment. So it's like stuff like that that impacts that impacted me, that impacted my brothers, you know, um, and it sticks with you. It sticks with you even when you do leave the house. Even when you do get your own place and start being an adult and paying bills, it stays with you. So like it's just paramount for parents with children um, to get the professional help and do the work necessary. Do the work necessary before you have kids, if you can, because emotional abuse is very real. It is very raw. Um, and it's actually, I feel like it's the most harmful of the abuse, of all the forms of abuse, because it's just everything is felt. It's not seen. It's felt. And how can you, and if your brain is developing, because your brain stops developing, it doesn't become fully developed until you're 25. So imagine being a 25-year-old person not able to, have their emotions in check or struggling with emotion dysregulation because they lived with a parent who couldn't do the same thing. They would and they had a parent yelling at them and screaming at them, humiliating them in public, dehumanizing them in public, calling them all kinds of names, because of their intersections. They're too fat, or they're too gay, or um they are to act as if act as if they are quote unquote normal, when in actuality they can't, because um of their neurodivergence, or because they want to look a certain way, act a certain way. They're humiliated and dehumanized. So if you are a survivor with children, please get it together and get help. So like, because it does hurt. It really does. And it does have an impact on the child's brain, and it does have an impact on their overall emotional state. So adult survivors of emotional abuse are more likely to experience the following: their difficulties with relationships, romantic or otherwise, addiction, people pleasing, emotional dysregulation, being too angry, or crying all the time, or just flipping out, and just having a strong emotional reaction to even the most minute things. Um, it is actually like a huge issue with um, those who lived by or internalized the wounded inner child archetype. Emotional dysregulation, anger is a huge thing. Mental health issues, narcissistic behavior. Sometimes it's like narcissistic behavior is possibly, in my opinion, developed. It definitely stems from some sort of emotional abuse where the child's needs were not met. And so they, instead of just, their way of coping is, you know, making sure they had power and control over other people's emotions because someone had power and control over theirs. It just all of a sudden becomes about them, and it just like narcissistic behavior has a mind of its own because now it's about them. Now it's about them using their resources and using their emotional resources, their physical resources in order to get the best of other people. So I've seen that a lot happen a lot too. Difficulty maintaining employment. If you're blowing up all the time, or you are depressed all the time, or you're calling off because like you're having all the time because you're about to have an emotional breakdown, or you just don't want to deal with people because of some sort of because they remind you of someone who emotionally abused you or whatever the case may be. It's hard to like deal with other people and their emotions when you are always thinking that they don't like you, or there's some anxiety around not being liked because you've been told as a young child like no one wants to be around you because you're not good enough or of whatever reason. So it's really hard to maintain employment because that involves dealing with people. It involves dealing with somebody who may have reminded you of the abuse you went through and you don't want to deal with it. So you're like, it does not surprise me that people with any sort of emotional abuse history, emotional and psychological abuse in particular, just in this case rather, not being able to keep a paycheck or to work a 9 to 5. Then you have suicidal ideations, chronic pain. I meant to tell you this. I meant to read these studies too, but apparently there are studies um, that that hypothesize that emotional fibromyalgia stems from emotional abuse, basically unhealed trauma stored in your body to the point where it's causing chronic pain. So that's something to look into. Lack of boundaries, guilt, shame, lack of vulnerability or oversharing, and distrust. So one way, okay, to overcome emotionally abuse history is to basically like start from the beginning to see where that where it came from, where it started, and most likely, like I said before, it started with our childhood. It started with our childhood. It started with our parents passing unhealed generational and historical trauma. And so in order for us to heal, we are to work with our inner child. We are to basically tap into that energy and rediscover our inner child and basically like work with them and have them work with us. Y'all become a team because at this point, you are a parent to your inner child, right? You are a parent to your inner child. They are to be part of your healing process and your healing journey, especially when there's childhood trauma involved. So these are ways to reparent your emotionally abused inner child. And one way is to inform your inner child that you, their parent, will do anything and everything to keep them safe. Basically, they deserve and you deserve a safe space to heal. This is particularly important for those who are thinking about getting out of a emotionally abusive relationship, or you've gotten out of that abusive relationship, but still feel as if you don't have a safe space. So remind your inner child that, for one, you got out of that situation. Therefore, you're going to do everything you can to keep them safe because you are keeping yourself safe. That's why it's so important to have a healthy support system as well. Inform your inner child that the abuse they've experienced was and will never be their fault or your fault. You didn't cause it at all. You didn't cause the abuse. You did not do anything to warrant that type of abuse or any sort of abuse. So it's very important for your inner child to understand and realize and internalize the fact that they did nothing wrong. If they were surrounded by adults who did not, they were surrounded by adults who did not do their own work and didn't have the capacity or the willingness to do their own work. Okay, so it was never their fault. Let your inner child know and internalize the fact that their feelings are valid. They're not too sensitive. They're not losing their minds. What happened was real. And they have every right to feel their emotions. They have every right to tell you about their emotions. They have every right to express how they felt. That's emotionally abusive in and of itself. When you're telling a child that their feelings are not valid and that their opinion doesn't count. Tell and demonstrate through your own healing work that healthy boundaries exist. They exist. When you are emotionally abusing someone, or a child rather, that's a violation of their boundaries. Your inner child was violated because their boundaries were violated. So through your own healing journey and your own willingness and your ability to set boundaries with people outside of you, you are teaching your inner child to do the same thing. You're demonstrating for your inner child to do the same thing, and how it's done in a healthy manner. Inform your inner child that they have the power and the right to manifest healthy, fulfilling relationships with other people. They are to realize that not everyone is out to get them. Not everyone is unsafe. Not everyone is emotionally abusive. Not everyone is trying to undermine them, humiliate them, dehumanize them, and basically break their spirit. That they do have the power and the right to find people who are here for them, starting with you. Starting with you. This is one of the reasons why you're going through the healing journey with your inner child, to show them that there are good people out here. There are people who are willing to love them unconditionally out here, to show them what reciprocity looks like. So here's a writing exercise, an introspection writing exercise that you can do on your own time. And so this involves meditation, or being in a safe place, and doing like some imagination work. This is where you tap into your magical inner child, tap into that inner magic, tap into your inner child's inner magic to do this, right? So imagine the family or group of friends you wish you had growing up. What type of family did you, when you think about family and when you think about a group of friends, just imagine them. Like, what do they look like? What do they look like? What do they sound like? Where do you live? What are they saying, so on and so forth. So while imagining this group of family and friends, reflect on the following questions. What would they be like? What are their personality traits? How do you interact with them, or they with you? How do you feel when you are around them? When you think about this particular group of people, what words and personality traits come to mind? So basically, this is you imagining what this family is like. What are their personality traits? How do they interact with you? How do you feel when you interact with them? How do they feel when they interact with you? What type of conversations do you have? What do y'all talk about? What do you do when you interact with them? What type of activities do you do when you are with them? And what words come to mind when you think of this family or a group of friends that you're imagining? And then you go ahead and list those words and personality traits that come to mind. Recite that list every day before and after you meditate, or imagine yourself engaging with these people with the personality traits and attributes you've listed. So, recite this list out loud while imagining yourself with this family and group of friends. Because every word and personality trait you list, that is what your inner child is looking for. That is what your inner child is craving. That is what your inner child deserves. That's what you deserve. So this is why you say to yourself, when you're imagining this group of people, this is what I seek because this is what I deserve, or something along those lines. This is what I seek because this is what I deserve. This is what I seek because this is what I deserve. Say it as many times as you can, but maybe before you read the list or after you read the list. This is about words becoming a powerful tool. This is about words casting a spell, or words being used to empower people who are struggling with with emotional abuse, or struggling with that feeling that they don't have real friends out here that care about them. We do have friends who care about us. And this, I'm going to be honest with you, like, this writing exercise works best if you're already doing the work with your inner child, or thinking about doing your inner work, thinking about doing work with your inner child, and dismantling the negative stories in your unconscious mind. It all starts with the mind. This introspection exercise is about pretty much dismantling and pretty much annihilating the stories, those negative stories that you have in your unconscious and subconscious mind that took on the life of their own. When you believe that you don't deserve friends, or you're not going to get friends, when you believe of those thoughts and those stories, you're going to feel as if you're going to feel as if you are undeserving. You're going to feel as if you're not lovable, that you are not loving, you're not deserving, right? And you're going to act as if. And then you're going to continue to be around people who reinforce those thoughts and reinforce that false story. But when you start to use your words to empower yourself, rewriting your story, you'll start to imagine a better life. You start to pretty much internalize and understand that you deserve people in your life who are going to love you unconditionally, starting with yourself. Starting with yourself. This is what I seek because this is what I deserve. And take deep breaths if you need to before you recite the words. This is what I seek because this is what I deserve. This is what I seek because this is what I deserve. This is what I seek because this is what I deserve. This is what I seek because this is what I deserve. Because you deserve it. You deserve reciprocity. You deserve to see yourself as loving. You deserve to be around people who see you as who you are and as a loving, capable individual with your own mind and your own beauty and your own traits and your own attributes that shine. You're a person of light. You're a person of being. You're a person who is capable of changing yourself and changing this world. You're capable of creation. You're capable of all kinds of things, of imagining, of playing, of creating a new life for yourself, of rediscovering your power, you're capable of being angry and being sad and being happy and seeing yourself as this multifaceted person. You deserve to have people in your life who feel the same way about you, the way you feel about yourself, when you start to see your worth. It's okay to have standards. It's okay to have boundaries. You're not pissing anyone off besides the people who were never here for you to begin with. You're capable of being in love. You're capable of creating this beautiful world for yourself and a beautiful reality for yourself. I cannot stress enough how much you deserve after what y'all been through, whether what we've been through. You deserve reciprocity and conditional love and unconditional love. So please, please, please imagine yourself. Imagine yourself with a family or a group of friends who see your light, who see your power, who see your divinity, who see your courage, who see who you really are, and who will love you as much as you love yourself, love you until you love yourself, because you also deserve support. I know for me, I would like to have friends who are supportive, loving, affectionate, witty, if anyone still uses that word, humorous, someone who is going to be non-judgmental, or a group of people who are not going to be non-judgmental, but are not afraid to give me constructive criticism. People who are supportive of my growth and my prosperity. People who are willing to reciprocate the same way I would. People who are willing to be honest with me. People who are affectionate and not just and not expecting anything other than my love, my presence when I walk into the room. That's what I'm looking for. That's what I have. And I manifested that by reciting those words, by just realizing that I deserve reciprocity. So this is an introspection writing exercise that I'm like introducing y'all to the world. If it helps, let me know. If there's more questions you would like to add to those questions, as long as you reflect on them, I would love to know more about them. If you so choose to share them. But I really do hope that this introspection writing exercise serves you well, because we deserve it. And I feel like words are to empower, not to inflict pain and suffering. So these are things to remember. The main purpose of emotional abuse is to dehumanize, humiliate the child in order to break their spirit and strip them of their personal power. You were never the problem. As a child, you were just surrounded by unhealed adults whose own emotional necessities weren't met. It's no excuse, but how, and because they are very much capable of looking at another human being and seeing their emotions, just like they were able to see a child and um, they were grown enough to do the work, is what I'm saying. But you are never the problem. You cannot change how or what an abuser feels about you. I'm going to be around. I'm going to be honest. You can't change or you can't change their mind about you. They feel the way they do because they have their own needs. A lot of their necessities were not met, and they are walking around unhealed. They're not tapped into their own inner child. They're not tapped into their own, right? They have not done their own inner child healing work. So you can't love and light abuse away. You just can't. You can't chant it away, pray it away. It's just best for you to just leave it alone and realize that they were never here for you. Okay? The abuser is responsible for their own work, just as you're responsible for yourself and your inner child. Okay? You're responsible for the only responsibility you have is the one for yourself, the responsibility for yourself and your inner child. You're not here to save everybody or change anybody. That's their responsibility. And I know there's a lot of people who want to be the savior of the family, but no, let's be real. If they really wanted to help, or if they really wanted to get better, they are to take responsibility for their own stuff, right? You have the power to create a healthy relationship with others. You have the power to recreate a new story regarding you and your interactions to empower yourself and your inner child. You are not your story. You are not your trauma story. You are not your past, and you have the power to change this stuff. You can't change the past, but you can change your reaction to the past and create a future and create a reality that has nothing to do with your trauma story. You're not here to just live in the past and to work on the past all the time. You are doing all this work that you are doing, whether it be with your inner child or your inner teen or your inner 20-year-old. You are here to help them heal so y'all can all live, a beautiful life that y'all deserve. You're not your trauma story. That's not what you're here for. And that's why we do this work. That is the main reason why we do this work. Okay? So I want to take a break. Please take a break, because we covered a lot and I said a lot, and I know I'm going to drink some water in a minute, but please take a break. And when we come back, we'll have a Q&A session. And we'll just go from there. All right. See you soon. Hey, everybody. This is Javi of the Inner Child Collective. Welcome back. Thank you so much for, if you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking around. We have our Q&A session. And again, if you have a question or a comment you would like to have read on the show, you can email your question at theinnerchildcollective@gmail.com. And or you can drop a line on my social media pages where I post a Q&A, the Q&A picture, or you can DM me, one of the three. But I would love to hear what you have to say, and it also gives me an opportunity to stay sharp and to share information with y'all. So let's get going with this. So here's a question that a friend of mine on Facebook asked me, while I was doing a live video, and she asked, do toxic people know they are toxic? And the answer to that is yes and no, right? So there are people in this world who know exactly what they're doing. They know they're being toxic. They know they're doing too much, right? And it's because for a few reasons. One of them is a defense mechanism. If you're pushing people away by doing the most, right? Because you don't want them to get close to you. You don't want them to know the real you or who you really are. It's that lack of vulnerability that gets people to act the fool like this, as far as being toxic. Then you have people who do it on a mere survival, and it's kept them safe. Then, like I said, people are toxic. Some people are toxic because it's a survival mechanism. They did what they needed to do. had to do in order to survive an environment that was hostile towards them or hostile in general. And it kept them safe for a minute, right? It kept them safe. Um, and they have not gotten out of it because it's worked for them for so long. And then there are folks who are just completely narcissistic and don't care about how their behavior impacts people. You know, they know they're being toxic. They know they're getting something out of it. They know they're hurting people because it's about power and control. And so they're just going to go ahead and continue to be toxic. So, yeah, there are people who know exactly what they're doing, and they don't care about what they're doing, or they feel as if they don't know another way or they're afraid to live another way. So that's about that. But then you have those who are not aware of their toxicity. A lot of the time when this happens, their toxic behavior usually comes from a place of them meaning well. Like they mean well, but they may or like overcross the boundary, or they may do some passive aggressive or microaggression, do some microaggressions, and because they are, their hearts are believe it or not, like these people don't, they mean well. And I see this a lot in the spiritual community too, where people, or in the religious community, people mean well, or they think they are giving you some sound advice, but most of the time it's something you did not ask for, and their hearts are in the right place, but because they're surrounded by people who don't have healthy boundaries, or there's they trust this person, don't want to hurt their feelings, they're surrounded by people who don't confront the behavior or say anything to this person about the behavior. And so, because in a sense, like, it's enabling, because they're not saying anything. So because they're around people who are not saying anything, enabling this behavior, the person doesn't even know they're causing harm. They don't know, right? And it usually happens, through unsolicited advice, and or some sort of behavior that they think is helping, or some sort of, it's usually like, it's just unintentional. Basically, the toxicity is unintentional. So the solution is to say something to the person about their behavior and how you feel about it. It's just best to tell them, like, look, I just wanted to tell you that I didn't like what you said. I found it to be very hurtful, and I don't know. I know that's not your intention. Um, I know that's not your intention. However, this is how I feel about it. So be aware of their reactions to what you're saying. Be aware of the reaction. Because if they are willing to, like, be open about, be open to what you're saying, and like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I know better for next time, and I would change my behavior, and even do some inner reflection work to determine what made me say that or do that or whatever. But if they become defensive and attempt to negate accountability for what they're saying, like, I don't know, like basically saying some stuff like, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm only trying to help, but I said it because of it, and they start to explain why they said what they said, or just in order to negate accountability, then it's time for you to ask yourself whether or not that relationship is to continue for your own mental and emotional health. Because at that point now, it's to the point where they may know what they're doing, they may not, they're afraid to hold themselves accountable, and they become defensive for whatever reason, and instead of listening to you, and it's time for you to, like, reevaluate whether or not, basically, like, for yourself, evaluate whether or not the relationship is to continue. So that is the end, folks. Thank you so much for, excuse me. Thank you so much for listening and watching. I really appreciate your energy. I really appreciate your time. And so, like, if you resonate with this episode, please follow me on the following: Anchor, Breaker, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Radio Public, Spotify, or wherever you find this podcast, the Inner Child Collective podcast. You can also follow me on social media, Facebook, Instagram. I have a couple of pages on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and now TikTok. So go ahead and do that so you'll never miss another video or miss some words of wisdom or whatever I got on there. Also provide services. Again, I provide services centering the inner child, anything and everything from inner child archetype readings to personalized bedtime stories. So if you're interested in getting a personalized service, you can visit www.theinnerchildcollective.com to book an appointment, and the link will be in the description. So thank you again so much for sharing your energy with me. I really appreciate y'all. And I really appreciate people. I just got a couple of people, to follow me on YouTube. And I have so many, I didn't realize I had so many listeners. So that tells me right there that I'm making an impact in some way, shape, or form. So thank you so much for following me. Thank you so much for your energy and your time. I really appreciate it. And so until next time, peace. See ya.